people might come away from an interaction with us thinking, wow, they're a fantastic, impressive person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel good about themselves or they feel that we are aligned with what's important to them. And that's the fundamental difference here. It's about creating these win-win situations where people feel they've been seen and they've been heard.
Welcome to the podcast about communication in business. I'm your host, George Torok. Did you know that I'm known as the speech coach for executives? That's because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success. And we do that through one-on-one coaching or group training for the team. On this podcast, you will hear insights and perspectives from communication experts from around the world. My guest today is Richard Reid. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Richard. He is an author, published author. His latest book, Charisma Unlocked, The Science and Strategy to Captivate, Influence, and Succeed in Business, was published in March. 2, he's a former chief people officer for a global law firm. I can imagine he has some really good stories he might tell if we had a few drinks. And 3, he's originally from the UK and now he lives in South Africa. Richard Reid, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me.
Delighted to be talking with you and especially exploring the topic of charisma, which perhaps many people think that it's something esoterical, it's this magical thing, but I'm hearing from you that there's science and psychology behind it. Why do you say that?
Because it's all based around how the brain works. So a big part of charisma is about psychological safety, how we make people feel. So actually they open up to us and they connect with us on a different level to how they might connect with other people. And I think this is often a misconception. People think it's about performance. It's about being the loudest, the most entertaining person in the room. And that could be good, but actually that could be quite superficial as well. It can also inhibit other people who might be more introverted. You're quite quiet. Somebody very loud and gregarious might overshadow your ability to be your natural self. So it's really about meeting people where they are and trying to connect with them at a deeper level so we can not only make them feel good about themselves, but also create more win-win situations in our interactions.
And I suppose we should start with clarifying what is it or how do you define charisma?
So charisma for me it's not about necessarily looking fantastic in front of other people. It's about how do we connect with them on a deeper level? How is it that we actually make them feel safe? So ultimately it's about how we make people feel. And, that sort of misconception about charisma, people might come away from an interaction with us thinking, wow, they're a fantastic, impressive person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel good about themselves or they feel that we are aligned with what's important to them. And that's the fundamental difference here. It's about creating these win-win situations where people feel they've been seen and they've been heard.
So I'm hearing, Richard, that we wrongly assume that charisma is about the individual and how they appear, but really it's about the people around the individual and how do they feel about that person.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the ripple effect that we create around us. And again, some of the things that we teach when we're talking about charisma are things like body language, how you use your voice, and all those things are important. But it all starts with how you manage your internal world. If you are not in command of your own emotions and thoughts, if you're not aware of what you're giving out into the world, then actually you can have all the skills and techniques in the world, but you're not going to use them in the most appropriate ways. And you're going to be less aware and have less capacity to recognize what other people need from those interactions. When we are at full capacity with our own thoughts and emotions, then we tend to objectify other people. We don't see them as individuals and we don't adapt our communication styles to bring out the best in those interactions. And that's really what's at the heart of charisma.
I remember a quote, and I can't remember who they attributed to it. I've actually heard it more than one way, so I'll leave the names out. But people commented about a particular individual and said, when that individual is in the room, they make you feel like they are the most important person in the room versus another individual is when that person is talking with you, they make you feel like you're the most important person in the room.
Yeah. And I think that is a big part of it. And I've heard that as well. I had it, I think I heard it about Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler, actually, but I'm sure it's been applied to lots of different people. But this is really key. It's about showing curiosity for other people rather than trying to impose ourselves on other people. And to show curiosity is about connecting with people, creating space for people. And again, going back to that idea of psychological safety, making people feel safe to share things with you that they might not share with other people. So you get an interesting insight into their world, which allows you to adapt your communication style and your messaging to better suit their needs.
How do we make people feel safe when we're the boss?
Interesting question. It comes up time and time again. And I think there's a few different things here. I think on an ad hoc basis, it's things like asking open-ended questions. It's creating space, not immediately jumping on the first thing that comes out of somebody's mouth. It's allowing a little bit more time for people to reflect on what they've said, because think about a lot of the interactions we have with people. We hold them to account for the first thing that comes out of their mouth. And a lot of the time, particularly if we're taking people into new directions in conversations, having conversations in ways they don't normally have conversations, that it may be what they're saying is the first time they've actually said that thing. So allowing people to qualify and reflect on what they've said is really, really important. But more than that, I think as a leader, it's about showing humility. And I think even in this day and age, there are lots of leaders who, rightly or wrongly, feel a pressure to know the answer to everything, to be the smartest person in the room. And it's great if you are, but whether you are or you aren't, it's about showing interest in other people's positions. It's about not immediately diving in with the answer to everything and allowing other people the opportunity to share their thoughts. It's deferring to other people before you say what you think. And sometimes it's about acknowledging your own difficulties or the fact that you might not understand something, and again, showing deference to other people. So all of these things are important, but also it's not just about in those ad hoc moments. It's about showing the consistency around that. So it's a very clear message that we're giving out to other people. And even when we disagree with people, or maybe we think people are wrong in their position, how we deliver that message is really, really important. If we are very dismissive of people, again, that undermines people's sense of safety. So in organizations and with individuals, the culture, the atmosphere that we create is really, really important. So people will speak up when they don't understand. People will speak up when they are in difficulty, or people might just challenge our prevailing views. And again, this is a problem in a lot of boardrooms, is that you get the risk of an echo chamber. People only share the thoughts that they think align with the prevailing thoughts or the preferences of the leader. So I think all these things are really, really important.
And Richard, I wish that you had coached an old boss of mine, because I remember every once in a while when he was in a cocky mood, which was every day, but once in a while he'd walk through the office, and he didn't walk, he'd strut. He'd strut through the office, and he'd say, "Someone's going to get fired around here today." And we'd all tremble. And I just wish I was brave enough to say, "Pick me." But we all trembled, and he did that. And certainly, it wasn't a productive or healthy environment.
And you know, you will know firsthand, I'm sure, but you know, when you're faced with that, sometimes it gets short-term results, but actually it doesn't make people speak up in the kind of scenarios we've just spoken about. And actually inhibits your business, because if you want to be innovative, if you want to be competitive and stand out from the crowd, you need people to come up with ideas and not be afraid they're going to be shouted down for it. And also as an organization, if to become a learning organization. So rather than punishing people for mistakes, obviously you don't want to make mistakes, but inevitably mistakes happen. Making them part of the culture where you can talk about them and learn from them and absorb them and move on from them is really, really important. And you look at some of the most successful organizations, you know, Google, Microsoft, they absorb this kind of learning into their culture, and they encourage people to experiment. And this is massive. I mean, what was that like for you? So you sort of trembled when you were on the end of those sort of comments. I'm guessing it probably affected your behavior.
It definitely was. It was horrible. It was a horrible feeling. It was a place that I didn't want to come to work to, but I was afraid. I didn't want to lose my job. I'd just been through a job change, and now I find out, I just entered hell. What do I do now? What a mistake I made. And so it was everything. Every decision was made based on fear. Fear that we might mess up, fear that we would get fired, fear that we'd have to come back to work tomorrow and put up with this crap some more.
Yeah. So nothing sort of aspirational in terms of the behaviours and the outlooks. It's all about kicking your head down, isn't it? It's not about what
it very much.
It's what we
it very much was.
Yeah.
Yep. It very much. It was a very destructive environment, and we did turn over people quite a bit.
Yeah.
And we go, there goes another dead body. And now on another case, I'm thinking I watched a person who's a leader of an organization, and I noticed, and he often needs to speak before in the group. And I noticed that he always appears extremely uncomfortable in front of the group. And I suspect, and please correct me or advise here, I suspect that's because he's over-focused on himself.
Totally. Totally. I do a lot of work with people who do public speaking, and a lot of time it's because people think, how am I coming across? And as soon as you start to do that, you become more self-conscious. You start to do things you wouldn't ordinarily do. So, I'm sure you work with these people as well. But one of the things that I always speak to people about is imagine you're giving your audience a gift, that actually you're giving them value, and focus on how it is that you want them to receive that. So again, your intended message. What is your intended message? How do you want people to feel when they hear that? And if you focus on that, you almost become the host rather than the guest. So rather than you feel like you're intruding, I'm trying to make people feel comfortable. I'm trying to make people feel a particular way that means they then act on the message that I'm giving them. And straight away you become less self-conscious, and that's helpful for everybody. So yeah, it is very much because we're putting ourselves at the center of things. So ego is in there, whether we realize it or not.
How would or might the leader's charisma change when there's a crisis? How do they adapt? How do they be the point of calmness, of sureness when they're not necessarily calm and sure, but how do they convey that to the rest of the group?
Yeah. So again, it starts with how you manage your internal world. So as a leader, you're going to be acutely aware of the risks involved in that crisis, but it's about focusing on how you want people to feel. So again, you're moving away from your own ego to your intended message. So if you want people to be calm, then you need to convey that. And generally speaking, when people panic, they speed up and they over elaborate. So when they're given a message, they over egg it. So it's often about slowing down, shorter sentences, and watch what I'm doing with my hands. So very slow, deliberate movements. Yeah. And one of the analogies that I use with people when I'm talking about this kind of messaging is to imagine a helium balloon. Okay. And the helium balloon represents the energy in the room. And if you put your hands wide, the helium balloon will rise. It will go to the ceiling. So in other words, that creates high energy. If you want to bring the energy down because people are panicked, you want your hands on top of the balloon. So hands close together and they're moving slightly downwards. So in other words, don't worry guys, we've got this under control. Everything's fine. And when you're doing that, you don't have to be disingenuous. You can talk about the challenges, but it's really important how you use your voice, how you use your body language to convey that. And whilst you want people to be aware of the risks involved in that crisis, you want them to be forward thinking. In other words, to be constructive. How are we going to take control of this situation? What are we going to do? Because when we just focus on the variables and we lose sight of our agency in that situation, that's when we start to panic. So putting some kind of action plan in place is really important as part of that. And getting people to think about how they can contribute to the action plan again starts to offset some of that anxiety. So those are the basic things that we would talk about in that kind of situation. And we might even use stories from our shared history as well. So have there been times we've had difficulty before? How have we dealt with those? Remember, we came through that together. Resourcing people, in effect. People often, when they're in panic, forget everything they're capable of. They feel very contemporary in those situations. So again, if we can resource people, that's also really useful.
You've mentioned the importance of managing the internal. Tell us more about that. How can we do that?
Okay. So it starts with self-awareness. So you need to know what you're feeling to know which course of action to take. And sometimes, even if we don't take a very obvious practical course of action with whatever we're feeling, sometimes just being aware that it's there will make us tread more carefully. So, for example, if I've just come from a meeting where I've had a very difficult conversation, I don't necessarily want that to spill over into the next conversation. So even just to be aware of that might mean I tread a little bit more carefully. I go a little bit more slower. I don't dive into the conversation and make assumptions about what somebody's saying. But very simple things that we can do, and it almost sounds so obvious that we don't do it, is simple things like just resetting our posture, managing our breathing. You know, even if you're going from Zoom call to Zoom call, as we often do these days, even if you've only got 30 seconds between calls, checking what's happening with your breathing and adjusting that can make a massive difference to how you are in your next meeting. Or again, setting your intention. So I've just come from one meeting. How do I want the atmosphere to be in this meeting? How do I want people to feel? Even just being aware of that gives us a North Star, something to aim for in that next meeting and to be aware of when we're deviating from that so we can recalibrate far quicker. So often we just go from meeting to meeting thinking about what we want to say rather than how we want to say and how we want people to feel. And that how we want people to feel is so important because that's the bit that people remember most. Yeah, because essentially we're sophisticated animals and we deal in emotions more than we deal in the rational. So getting that right is fundamental.
And that's true. I know many people who run from meeting to meeting, virtual meeting to virtual meeting, even in the office. If there's a routine, and perhaps you've said it already, but maybe you can elaborate. If there's a routine that you suggest people go through when they finish the meeting and while they're getting ready for the next meeting, what might that routine be?
Yeah. So I think building the routine is really, really important because otherwise we're operating what's called system one of the brain, which is all about getting things done quickly. And it's often about seeing people as objects, either conduits for what we want to achieve or blockers for what we want to achieve. So even just pausing for 30 seconds, lifting our head and looking around us, adjusting our breathing starts to reverse that stress response. In other words, it starts to take us from system one of the brain to system two of the brain, where we have more nuance, we have more emotional intelligence, and we are more likely to show the kind of curiosity that I mentioned earlier. In other words, we see people as individuals and we don't dive in quickly and make assumptions about what somebody's saying. So all of these things mean that we're more attuned in that situation and we have more spare capacity to change tack if we need to. And this is often the problem because we're rushing around, capacity is full. So actually anything that comes in, our response to it tends to be more heavy-handed than it would be if we've offset some of that in between meetings. So these are just small things that we can do. Setting intentions whilst also managing what's happening internally, or at least being aware of it, is really, really helpful.
I'm detecting a glimmer of meditation in those moments. Is that something you suggest?
Yeah, so it is along those kind of lines. Often when you talk about the idea of meditation, people react badly to it, particularly with a business context. So, but it fundamentally is, or mindfulness. But at the very least, what you could say is it's resetting. It's resetting and regrouping. In the same way that we might do at the end of a sports match or at half time in a sports match, you regroup. How are we getting on? What do we need to do next? It's exactly the same principle. So sometimes talking about it in that more practical way tends to get people on board with it. Whereas sort of mindfulness and meditation, people have very mixed feelings about it. But that's fundamentally what it is. It's about setting your intentions and your focus rather than just going with what happens to be the default position that you normally take. It's being deliberate and purposeful. And this is really, really important if we want to see people as individuals.
And Richard, you're taking me back in and time again. This is when I was in university. I joined the karate club, and I remember the fun part was sparring, fighting. However, of course, you'd end up with some bruises. But I remember before, anytime we would spar, we would be told to calm ourselves, to clear our mind, to be totally open so that we could be in the moment and deal with our opponent. And then after the match is over, it's never personal. Again, we're told to clear our mind, and whether we lost or not didn't matter. It was like the match is over now.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic story there, George. I think that, that really sort of sums up. That's what it's about. It's setting your intention rather than allowing your emotions just to run. And this is what happens is we go from one situation to another and we get what's called emotional leakage. So using your example, maybe you were annoyed because you'd lost the match. You then take that to everything else that you do without necessarily being aware of that. So there's that unhelpful ripple effect that happens. And that really sort of anti-charisma is about what's going to best suit this situation. How can I deliberately bring those aspects of myself to bear in this situation? It's not about blindly going into the next situation and hoping for the best.
Emotional leakage. I think that's a relevant term that we need to be aware of, because you're right. We are emotional beings, and we're often, our emotions leak from one incident to an entirely unrelated issue that we need to deal with. And we probably don't stop to think about, okay, what emotion am I feeling from that last incident that's got nothing to do with what's coming up here, but I'm carrying it in here anyways because I'm going to show them.
Absolutely. In the UK, maybe you have the same. You say it's having a bad day and going home and kicking the cat. Yeah. Yeah. Because you haven't dealt with things at the time that they happened, either internally or in terms of addressing it with the individuals concerned. And this is what happens. So that we are no longer in control of how we behave it.
Yes. And some people do that, kicking the cat when they're driving in their car. What are you doing here?
Exactly. It's very rarely about the people around you.
And so what have you found has been the most helpful routine that people can do on a regular basis to become more aware of these leaked emotions and address them?
So I think, going back to what we said before, I think that the brief pauses in between meetings are important. But what you can do is allocate deliberate time for self-reflection. And a lot of people, particularly, when they're very busy, they think, well, that's lost time. That's time when I could be doing things. But actually, in my own experience and experience of coaching people, when you allocate time, even just 10 minutes first thing in the morning before you look at your emails, think about the key events you've got coming up that day. How do I want to be in those situations? What is the atmosphere I want to create? What do I need to perhaps tweak in my diary today to play to my strengths? Because sometimes things come into our diary and actually it means that we are then in a less capable state to deal with things that are really important later in the day. So that 10 minutes at the start of the day, it might feel like it's time out your day, but it might mean that actually you're more effective and more impactful in the time that you are working. So it's not just about doing the hours, it's how you engage with those tasks. And again, reflecting at the end of the day for 10 minutes can be useful, both in terms of recognizing movement in activities. So in other words, I might not have completed this project. This is how it's moved from the start of the day. This is something I've done well. This is something I've brought to a situation. It all helps with our resilience and that sense of self. But also we can start to reflect on how we were. So what can I learn from that I can do better tomorrow? So we can compete with ourselves. We can be better versions of ourselves every day. And when we don't do that, then actually behaviors become more extreme. We don't take care of ourselves. In other words, we're not making early interventions to address things. We're allowing them to become bigger problems. And this is often the case with our energy levels. How often do people go on holiday and they get ill, or they spend the whole of the first week sleeping because they haven't been managing their energy and they haven't been adjusting their diary to take into account how events affect them. This is really, really important. And energy is also really important day to day. So, for taking me as an example, I do my best work early in the morning. So actually registering that allows me to recalibrate my day and put boundaries around certain things that allow me to do my best work and be the best version of myself and give other people the best version of myself. So, this reflection time at the start and the end of the day is massive. It's actually not lost time. It's quality time to really make the most of the time when you are working.
And I'm also better in the morning, so much so that I refuse to go to evening meetings these days. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm not going to the evening meeting. You want to meet? We'll meet in the afternoon or the morning. So that's something to be aware of, that we each need to be aware of. And I suppose, depending on your situation, sometimes you have to operate during that period when you're not at your best.
Yeah.
How do you prepare for that? Okay, so let's say you or I have to go to an evening meeting and we have to look good.
Yeah, so I think there's two elements to this I'd mention. I think the first one is, I think a lot of the time we're not assertive enough. So somebody says, right, I want to meet at this time, and we just go with it. And we don't want to be, come across as difficult, but sometimes negotiate it. Is there any chance we could do this earlier in the day? I've got a slot available at this time. Sometimes that works. But if we can't do that, and sometimes in reality we can't do that, then it's about acknowledging that and putting steps in place to try and mitigate against that. So it might be, for instance, if I know I'm not necessarily at my best in the afternoon, it might be I clear things slightly earlier in the day to conserve some energy. It might be I put a bit more of a buffer around that meeting. Or it might be I do particular exercises before I go into that meeting that activate me if I feel I'm going to be low on energy. So, for example, you may have seen or read about the work of Amy Cuddy. And Amy Cuddy talks a lot about how you hold your body and how it influences your confidence, your energy levels, all those kinds of things. So sometimes, even if we don't have a choice about when we're going to have a meeting, doing little exercises like that where we make ourselves bigger before a meeting can make a big difference to how we are in the meeting. And even when we choose to eat. So quite often when people choose to eat and what they choose to eat means that they have a mid-afternoon slump. So it might be, if you know that's you, if you can't move a meeting, you do something different with what you eat or when you eat in order to mitigate against the risk of those sort of things happening. So I think these are the kind of things that we can do. And a lot of the time, just even drinking more water. We don't drink enough water. So being aware of that might mean, right, I'm going to make a deliberate intention to drink more water because I know that helps with my energy levels going into the meetings later in the afternoon. So it's having more influence over how we run our diaries rather than just allowing things to come into our diaries and not taking steps to either push back on that or to put practical things in place that mean that we manage our energy levels according to what is in place.
Richard, I'm hearing that there's a lot, but there's small things that go into how we can influence how we feel and the charisma that others feel from us. And we just need to pay attention to these little details. It's not simply about going, well, I'll just have to put on an act and just show how great I am, and they don't have to know.
Exactly. When we put on a big act, that's not sustainable. That's quite tiring. You can do it now and again, but doing that all the time is tiring. There are people who do that, and often they feel that sort of imposter syndrome. So this is trying to be, we've all got to adapt slightly when we go into different environments, but it's trying to be as true to who you are as possible and doing things to manage that. And I think it's quite right what you say. A lot of the time, it's those micro habits, those atomic habits that can go a long way. And I remember a story a few years ago. So it was the Great Britain cycling team, and the guy in charge, David Brailsford, was being interviewed. So, well, why are you winning all these gold medals? You never used to win gold medals. And he said, well, the French think it's because we've made our wheels bigger and we've been accused of this and we've been accused of that. He said, it's none of those things. It's just we break down everything we do and we try and improve it by 10%. And all those little 10% coming together make a massive difference overall. And quite often that's the case when it comes to how we conduct ourselves in the workplace. It's not always about making dramatic changes. It's small incremental changes that we then absorb, make part of who we are, and make part of our regular habits that go a long, long way.
Do you suggest people keep a journal of those 10% or 5% that they do on a daily basis?
Definitely. And most people don't like the idea of keeping a journal, but if you're willing to try, then I think it's a fantastic thing to do, because that's how you measure your improvement. You know, quite often we don't register an improvement until a long time afterwards, because we're not actively registering and reflecting on how things are going, and we're not fine tuning. And so this is often why we give up far earlier on these new habits, because we don't recognize the benefit they're serving. And this is particularly the case when we're very busy, because when we're very busy, we tend to only look at things in extremes. We don't notice those small differences. So doing this over a period of time, maybe doing an experiment over the course of a month, charting that day by day and reflecting back on that, not only daily, but weekly and monthly, allows you to start to chart that progress and to have the confidence to stick with it. So definitely it's really, really important, but also not to wait until the end of the month to think, what do I need to change? If you're doing it day to day, you can make those adjustments as you go along.
Little changes every day can make a big difference. Richard, for people who like to know more about you and the Charisma Masterclasses and coaching, they can visit your website, and that link is in the description below. And for those listening, it's richard-reid.com, and live events, charisma workshops, and there's dashes in there between the words, but you'll find that link in the description below. Richard, as we prepare to wrap up, imagine you're sitting with a team leader who wants to not only improve themselves, but improve the charisma, the feeling of the whole team. If there's 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice you would give that leader to help their team improve, what would that be?
Really good question. I think the main thing would be promoting that idea of psychological safety, because charisma comes in lots and shapes and sizes. And actually, if we want people to be charismatic, it's about them really leaning into who they are at their essence. And a lot of the time, we're afraid to do that. And so we show a very vanilla version of ourselves, or we only show the aspects of ourselves that we think fit in with how everybody else is. So creating psychological safety really allows people to feel empowered and encouraged to be who they are, both in terms of their opinions and their behaviors. And so they start to build a more solid brand. And at the heart of charisma, it's really about your personal brand. Who are you in your essence? It's not about being like everybody else, but it's about being true to who you are and having the confidence to step into that. So as the team leader, doing that, I think it's really good in terms of building people's sense of self-worth, but it's also really good in terms of building a team that is open to challenge, is willing to grow, and creates innovation and challenges that status quo. So if you want a team that's going to grow and thrive, it's really about how you promote that psychological safety. And that is about giving people space and encouragement to be who they are. So as a team leader, showing curiosity for that, absorbing mistakes into that. In other words, demonstrate what we call the growth mindset. In other words, we learn from our mistakes and we learn together, is really, really important. And, you know, any organization that wants to thrive and step out from the crowd needs to have that psychological safety at the heart of it.
My guest today is Richard Reid, and I'm going to remind you of that powerful phrase, allow people to have psychological safety. If you like what you heard, tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.